if you could take a moment while you're tuning in today to just fill that out so that we can follow up with you after this presentation, share the content and any other workshop opportunities in the future. We would greatly appreciate it. So jumping right in, as Chris mentioned, I'm Kendall Barbary. I'm the Programs Director for GreenWave. I've been with the organization since 2017. I'm joined today by my colleague, Lindsay Olson, our new Farmer Training Program Manager. So GreenWave is a bi-coastal nonprofit organization based in New Haven, Connecticut on Quinnipiac land, which is where I'm based. But we also have staff and board members in New York, Massachusetts, California, and Alaska, which is where Lindsay is based and joining you this afternoon. GreenWave's mission is to train and support regenerative ocean farmers growing seaweed and shellfish in the era of climate change. And we offer a mix of training, one-on-one support, and coming soon, easily accessible online tools to help farmers establish sustainable, thriving businesses. I know many of you are already shellfish farmers, and much of this is probably old hat. But so that we're all on the same page today, I just want to clarify what we mean when we're talking about regenerative ocean farming. Essentially, it's a polyculture farming model with a mix of seaweed and shellfish that produces high yields on a small footprint and doesn't require fertilizers, feed, or fresh water. Instead, it provides a host of benefits to both the marine environment and to our coastal communities, including sequestering carbon and nitrogen, rebuilding marine ecosystems, producing nutritious food, creating jobs, and preserving the ocean commons. This type of farming can come in all shapes and sizes and is ultimately site-specific. We'll give you a little preview of some of that today. The simple illustration that you see on this slide just shows one of the many ways that seaweed and shellfish might be farmed together. On our farm in the Thimble Islands, we grow a mix of sugar kelp, eastern oysters, blue mussels, and I've also tried bay scallops and clams. We were one of the first commercial kelp operations in southern New England, thanks in no small part to the Yarish Lab and other collaborators at institutions across the area. And over the years, we've developed expertise in sugar kelp cultivation. We also run a kelp hatchery out of our hub in Fairhaven, Connecticut, and this year supplied 15 ocean farms from New York to Massachusetts with kelp seed. So today, as Chris pointed out, we're really here to talk about kelp farming and the state of the industry in southern New England. In just a moment, I'm going to turn over the floor to our Farmer Training Program Manager, Lindsay, and she's going to give a brief overview of what kelp is, how we grow seed, talk about how you might go about finding a site to grow your crop if you don't already have one, share some basic long line design concepts, hone in on important decisions you'll need to make around anchors and line and other infrastructure that will be necessary to set up a kelp farm. And lastly, we'll touch on emerging market opportunities for kelp in the region. Lindsay, turning the floor over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kendall. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you today. So jumping right into the content outline that Kendall just went through, I wanted to give you all a visual. So this is our farm in the Thimble Islands near Branford, Connecticut, on the north shore of Long Island Sound. And Bren Smith, who Chris mentioned earlier, our founder, has been farming on these waters for over a decade. And it was here that some of the first hatchery reared sugar kelp seed was outplanted and grown into mature kelp in the US. And like Kendall mentioned, our ability to farm sugar kelp is really due in no small part to the work of Dr. Charles Yarish and his proteges at the University of Connecticut, Stanford. And Dr. Yarish's work really helped us close the life cycle for sugar kelp, making it possible to capture and control the growth of kelp spores in a hatchery setting and transplant them out onto ocean farms in order to reach maturity. So before we jump into the nitty-gritty details of setting up a farm, let's just take a step back for a second and remind ourselves again, what is seaweed? So seaweed is a common name for algae, which broadly are a diverse group of photosynthetic aquatic organisms that need the energy of the sun to grow. So they use that energy to synthesize food out of carbon dioxide and water, and they turn it into tissue. It's been estimated that there are anywhere from 30,000 to 1 million species of algae in the world, and they range from microscopic free-floating organisms or microalgae, such as the phytoplankton on the left side of the slide here, to large multi-celled green, red, brown species that grow from rocks and substrate along our coastline. And a common group of these macroalgae are kelp. And again, the most commonly cultivated kelp in the US is sugar kelp. An image of a blade of sugar kelp is on the right here. Sugar kelp is native to the ocean waters of New York and New England, and it's what we'll be focusing on pretty much exclusively today. It has three main physical components of note. You can see there is a holdfast down there at the bottom, which is a stiff and knotty root-like structure that affixes it in place either to the bottom where it might grow in the wild or to a line if you're farming it. And then a narrow stipe that connects to a long, delicate blade. And kelp are some of the fastest growing organisms on Earth. They start out as tiny microscopic spores, as you can see in this diagram up in the top, and they'll grow into their adult form in just a matter of months. And depending on the species and the location, an adult sugar kelp blade may grow 20 feet long or more in just one season. And other species of kelp grow over 100 feet in length, such as bull kelp. So how does this hatchery process work? How do we how are we able to farm kelp? Well, when we do this, we take advantage of the kelp's natural reproductive cycle. We collect fertile parent tissue in the wild and controlling the release of spores in a lab environment. So in the photo on the left, you can see a picture of wild kelp that has reached its sexual maturity. And you see there's a dark band down the middle, and that's called the sorus, which is the reproductive tissue. So in the wild, when the light, temperature, and salinity conditions are right, that sorus will release thousands of microscopic spores that float through the water column until they settle on the bottom. If they're fertilized, they'll attach and grow into mature kelp blades. So we really just replicate this naturally occurring process in a controlled hatchery setting. And by doing that, we carefully remove the sorus tissue from the wild parent kelp. We put it into a beaker like you see in the middle of the slide, and we trick it by replicating those conditions that I just mentioned into releasing its spores. And then we pour that intensified spore solution over spools of specialized seed string. So over the course of 6 to 8 weeks, we keep these inoculated spools in tanks of recirculated seawater at just above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and we control for light, dissolved oxygen, and nutrients during that time. And the spools are monitored daily to check for growth, like the microscopic sporophytes that you can see on the left of this photo. We look at those under the microscope quite often. And after about 2 months of tending, the spools are then transferred from the hatchery to the farm where they're outplanted onto grow lines. This year, our hatchery produced 198 spools for 15 farms across the region, which is just over 7.5 miles of seed string. So by this point, when the kelp is ready to be outplanted, the baby kelp have taken hold of the string that are wrapped around the spools. And so to outplant, we fasten that string to a larger diameter grow line, either by splicing the seed string directly into the weft of the line or by using black electrical tape or a fastener. And using a small skiff or a boat to maneuver, we gently unwind the seed string from the spools directly onto the grow line. And then over time, as the kelp grows, it will naturally affix directly to the larger diameter line, and that itself becomes the grow line. So here on the left, you can see an image of us gently unspooling the kelp spool onto that grow line. And during this process, the kelp seed is particularly vulnerable. It's just come from the hatchery. This is the first time it's being transferred into the wild. And best practice says that you shouldn't outplant when air temperatures are below freezing or during wet weather because the fresh water could potentially harm the blades. And during this process of outplanting, we try really hard to handle the seed string as little as possible. So we'll actually use a pair of vice grips to hold the spool, so we're not touching the seed string with our fingers or with gloves. And we'll grip it as it's being unwound with those vice grips, gingerly attach it to the grow line, and then gently place it back in the water. And if all goes well and the spools are handled properly, your newly outplanted lines will show visible growth within the first month, and they should be ready to harvest between April and June. Okay, so now you have an idea of how the hatchery process works and how we go about getting seed in the water. So you might be thinking, all right, sounds pretty good, want to know more. How do I set up a farm? So for those of you who already farm shellfish, you probably already have a site in mind and you've gone through this process. But for folks who are just starting out and are new to ocean farming, the first step is deciding where to farm. And that decision involves getting to know your area and your water pretty intimately. And there are 3 things that we recommend you consider when you're evaluating the suitability of a potential farm site. Those are access, social and cultural suitability, and the biophysical suitability of a site. So first, access. Here, what we mean is if you take stock of all the resources that you have access to, what things, people, or organizations could help you get your farm up and running? So these are just really just like resources at your disposal. This could range from tangible equipment necessary to operate your farm, like a boat or a line or gear that you use or repurpose from other parts of your work or your life, to intangible assets such as relationships with other growers in your region. Maybe you have a slip at a marina nearby or a connection with a certain buyer. These are all resources that will help you figure out where geographically it makes sense for you to start your farm and where you're the most connected. And then within this consideration, you also want to think specifically about access to seed. Are there hatcheries in your region that will grow and supply kelp seed? What permits or licenses do you need to grow it? In this case, Greenwave has been working to support Stony Brook to develop a hatchery so they can support other growers in New York State. And Mike is going to talk about that opportunity in just a bit. And then lastly, access to markets. This is a critical piece of resource mapping, of figuring out what exactly you'll do with the kelp when it comes out of the water. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to give an overview of the state of the market in Southern New England, and then Mike is also going to talk about this later on. Okay, so after you figured out generally where it makes most sense for you to farm, you want to start thinking about the suitability for a particular site in that region. And here it's really important to understand the way that your site and the waters nearby might be used by different people. Because after all, we're farming the ocean, and that means that we're pretty much farming the commons, and being a respectful neighbor really can go a long way. So some questions that you might want to consider as you're weighing the pros and cons of different sites is the shoreline near your site developed or undeveloped? Would coastal residents consider the buoys of your farm to be a visual nuisance, or are people generally supportive of ocean farming in your region? Is the water you intend to site a popular place for recreational or commercial fishing, or are there established navigation channels nearby that might give a lot of traffic, boat traffic to your farm site? And do any tribes or indigenous communities live nearby? Is this site of significance to the indigenous people in your region? Something you really want to think about. And some of these conflicts you might be able to identify on a map, but others you'll just learn by talking to people and spending time on and around your prospective site. So it's just so important to be out there on the water where you think you're going to start your farm, just really making connections and figuring out what it is like at that particular space. And then finally, you'll want to pay attention to the biophysical characteristics of your site. These are the natural elements that will make your farm site unique. And ultimately, you might be able to form a new market or resolve a conflict with your neighbor, but if kelp doesn't grow well on the site you've selected, your business might be doomed from the start. So it's really important to think about these elements when you're figuring out where to site your farm. So to grow sugar kelp, The ideal environmental conditions that we generally recommend are a site with minimal exposure to the prevailing wind and weather. You want it to be fairly protected. But that said, you do need enough current flow to bring in fresh nutrients. But you don't want so much current that it's going to put a lot of drag force on your anchoring systems. So we generally recommend somewhere between 1 to 2 knots of flow at peak, ebb, and flood during the tide cycle. You're looking for a spot that's got salinity levels above 26 parts per thousand, ideally somewhere between 20 and 32 parts per thousand. And just as reference, deep ocean water salinity is 35 parts per thousand. So it's okay for this water to be a little bit less saline than other parts. But kelp, again, is an ocean species, so it likes having a more saline environment. You want water temperatures that stay between 32 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit during the growing season, which is typically sometime between October and May. And you don't want it to get so cold that you have recurrent sea ice. That's not ideal. The water clarity should be somewhere between 1 to 2 meters below the surface. And you'll also want to make sure you're not siting your farm over any submerged aquatic vegetation, such as seagrass or eelgrass, which is an important marine habitat. And in the past, GreenWave has recommended that sites have a minimum depth of 25 to 40 feet at mean low water. That helps keep your kelp suspended and off the bottom at all stages of the tide to reduce fouling. But thanks to the work at Stony Brook, and as Mike will speak to directly in more detail during his presentation, we know that kelp also grows well in shallow water sites. It just might require a bit of a different gear setup. So now you've gone through the important steps of selecting a site and figuring out where you're going to source your seed. We're going to drill down on some of the design concepts to help you get started with that farm design. So the concept of a sugar kelp farm is pretty simple. There are horizontal long lines that are wrapped with seed string, and together those are called the grow line. The grow line is submerged somewhere between 1 to 2 meters below the surface. It's secured on either end by an anchor or a pair of anchors. The line is tensioned and held under tension in this system by the anchors, and also by a series of buoys that are suspended along that grow line. And this entire system of the long line that I just described is called an array. And typically a farm is composed of multiple arrays. So the most basic and the classic design is the single line array. And it's really as simple as it sounds. There's one horizontal kelp grow line. It's again submerged several feet below the surface, wrapped in seed string, attached to buoys on either end, and suspended by these attached to anchors on either end, and then suspended by buoys along its run. So you can see here in the image, those black buoys next to the boat, that is demonstrating those buoys that would be along the grow line. And this is our farm in the Thimble Islands. This is the system that we recommend to all new farmers who are experimenting with or just starting out farming sugar kelp. It's the tried and true method for cultivating sugar kelp, and we really think that it's the way to go. So here's a diagram of what a single line array might look like from above on the top during that aerial view, and then in profile. So to get a little bit more specific, you can see here the blue line in this diagram indicates the water level. Below there's the horizontal line that is in parallel to the surface, is the grow line or long line. There are those buoys throughout. There is an anchor line buoy at either end of the kelp grow line that then connects down to the anchors. And in this case, those are embedment anchors. And then those anchors have a tag line, which goes up to an anchor retrieval buoy or a tag line buoy at the surface that just allows you to access those anchors. And we'll talk more about specific anchor considerations in just a second. So for the single line arrays we use on our farm, we try to eliminate unnecessary hardware that could rust or fail and just keep it as simple as possible. So for example, we attach our grow lines directly to our anchor lines by using a butterfly loop or any knot that will release after It's been under quite a bit of tension. And a double-eyed pigtail, which is this green braided line you can see on the right that's been looped through itself. And we do this instead of using any clips, links, or shackles. And then we will take our grow line after we have outplanted the kelp seed onto it, and we'll tie it with a bowline directly to this pigtail loop. So again, you have the grow line that has the kelp seed on it. It's tied with a bowline to this pigtail. This pigtail is then looped through the anchor line that goes down to the bottom and holds the system in place. So as we're outplanting the seed, we will splice in the buoys at intervals along the grow line to support the weight of the lines as the kelp grows. This also provides us access points to the gear. So during the growing season, when we want to go check on the kelp, we're able to pull up the line and assess how well it's growing without disturbing the kelp line by hooking the growing line itself. So we will use a FID just at intervals. On a 200-foot grow line, we would put every 50 feet, we would put a buoy, and we'll just use the FID to open the weft of the line, stick the buoy line through, and tie a knot there to keep it interspersed in the line. And then to connect our anchor line to our chosen anchor, we use a pair link and a shackle connection between the line itself and the anchor chain. And here the knot that we tie is an anchor bend. That knot will help minimize chafe, but it can also be removed after tension and wear. So this is, again, is the connection where the anchor line is being connected directly to the anchor itself on the seafloor. And from the surface, this is what it looks like. And the other thing to note is that we're able to attach mussel socks and lantern nets to our single line arrays. And we do that in our polyculture farming method, because again, the simple line array is the simplest setup to get started kelp farming with. So next, I want to give a brief introduction to a slightly more complex setup that we're experimenting with on our farm and farmers are using in other regions. It's called the 5-line array, and it was developed by Cliff Gowdy and Associates. So here, there are 5 parallel grow lines. You can see them in the foreground of this image, and they're held apart by a spreader bar, which in this case is a 10-foot long aluminum pipe that's about 3 inches in diameter. And you can just make out the spreader bar in the distance of this image. It's at the base of that black triangle that's been outlined there in the distance. And this whole matrix of lines is suspended below the water with a buoy and bridle system. And that is shown as the 2 sides of that black triangle are the bridle, and then the buoy is on the surface. So to get a slightly different view, here is a diagram like we saw for the single line array. And as you can see, there's a number of elements that are similar to the single line array. It's still anchored to the bottom. There's still buoys that attach it to the top. The main difference, again, is that there's the spreader bar and those 5 long lines of even length that are spaced 2 feet apart. And the spreader bars are holding them in place on either end. The things to note here is that there is a V-shaped bridle that I pointed out in the previous image that runs from the spreader bar to the buoy on the surface. But then there's another V-shaped bridle that runs from the spreader bar to a connection point along the anchor line, and that will stay underwater. And it's also important to note that this system works best under fairly constant tension. And it's critical when cutting and assembling the lines that they're cut to matching lengths, otherwise it will sit kind of all cattywampus in the water. And the benefit of this system is that it really allows us to pack in quite a bit of lines into a small footprint. So here are a few images of setting this up on dry land where we prep the gear before we deploy it in the water. And a couple differences to note compared to the single line system where the grow line is tied to the pigtail connection. With the 5-line, we actually will splice a C-link shown up here in the upper right into the grow line itself that allows us to quickly connect and disconnect the grow line to the spreader bar during outplanting. And then on the photo on the left, here is the bridle that I was describing that will connect the spreader bar to the anchor line, and that will be suspended underwater. And then what you don't see in this picture is that second bridle that goes up to the surface and holds it in place. So as you can probably tell, the system is more complex, requires a bit more precision and finagling to get right. So we don't recommend it for first-time farmers. But again, the benefit is that it really allows us to produce significantly more kelp without increasing the footprint of our farm. Okay, so now that you understand how all those pieces fit together, there are a couple decisions about what type of gear you want to use that are probably going to come up as you go about starting your farm. And one important choice is line. What type of line should you use? And you'll probably want different types of line for different applications. For example, you might use 1/2-inch tri-strand for your grow line, but you'll need a thicker line for your anchors. So we recommend just starting off by familiarizing yourself with different types of line on the market to determine which types of line might be most useful for different applications on your farm. But the most important factor to keep in mind when you're thinking about line is its density. The density of the line will determine if it floats, sinks, or remains neutrally buoyant in the water. So in general, polypropylene line will float. Nylon, polyester, and natural fibers will sink. And neutrally buoyant lines are typically a blend between polyester and polypropylene. In general, sinking or neutrally buoyant line is best for your grow lines, for the flotation buoy lines, and any line within the first couple meters below the water surface, because it will reduce the risk of entanglement and it will keep your kelp below the surface. But you may want to consider using floating line for the portion of your anchor line that is closest to the bottom to try and keep it off of the seafloor. But whatever you do, you should not use leaded line for seaweed cultivation because kelp will absorb heavy metals and the lead could potentially contaminate your crop. And you also probably want to avoid any line that contains an anti-fouling treatment, as this could potentially prevent the kelp from growing. And a fun sort of side note is that there are researchers who are experimenting with natural fiber lines like hemp, which shows a lot of promise for the industry to eliminate plastic-based line altogether. So for our grow line, we've worked with Ester Pro, which is a sinking line, and Hydro Pro, its neutrally buoyant sibling. And we have also taken old crab line from our oyster cages and repurposed it for growing kelp. Sometimes the line that shows a little bit of wear, but it's still durable and doesn't have any significant nicks, will create a nice fuzzy surface for the baby kelp to attach to. And also to keep in mind, the best type of line is free line. So ask around and see if anyone you know is getting rid of lightly used line or selling it cheaply. But again, remember, in general, it's best to use sinking or neutrally buoyant line to reduce entanglement risks and to protect that seed string from floating near the surface. And then you could consider floating line at the bottom of your system down by the seafloor. In general, 3/8 to 1/2 inch should work well for most applications in your grow line. 3/8 is quite a bit cheaper, but 1/2 inch has a little bit more surface area for the kelp to settle and attach. And this season, we're actually working with some folks to compare these two diameter lines side by side to see if there's a significant difference in biomass and yield that outweighs the difference in cost of these two lines. And if all goes well, come spring, you'll end up with a dense, healthy crop of kelp. So next on your list of choices is what anchoring system to deploy. And ultimately, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for anchors. Your choice should be determined by a number of factors and tailor-suited to your site. So the things that you'll want to know first and foremost is your bottom type. Knowing what is appropriate for your bottom type, knowing what type of anchor is appropriate for your bottom type will help you make the most important decisions around what type of anchor to deploy. And then once you've got that figured out, you'll also want to take into account exposure to wind and weather, the current, the potential biomass or how much kelp might grow on your lines during a season, and then the size of your lease. So you'll compare different anchor holding powers and costs, and then try to figure out what is right for you. This is a complex process, so I'm going to try and break it down a little bit more and provide you a little bit more guidance for how to go about making this choice. So there are quite a few different anchors on the market, but here are some of the types that are commonly used in kelp farming. They include helical or screw anchors, fluke and other drag embedment anchors, pyramid anchors, mushroom anchors, and concrete blocks. And then again, there are other types that are used, but these are some of the most common. But not all of these anchors are suited to the same bottom type. For example, a helical anchor, a screw anchor might work great on a sandy bottom, but it'll pull out and dislodge from loose gravel. So again, really knowing what your bottom looks like is critical for choosing what type of anchor to deploy. And next, you want to consider the holding power or the breakout force. This is the amount of force in pounds that it takes to dislodge a properly embedded anchor. And it varies significantly from anchor to anchor. And again, really depends bottom type and whether or not you were able to properly embed that anchor when it was deployed. The actual holding power of an anchor can be greater than or less than the values that are provided here, but these numbers represent a conservative holding power estimate for these different types of anchors in their preferred bottom type and conditions. But what does this really mean in reality? To give you an example, to put it in context, if I have a 200-foot long single grow line, like the one that I showed you earlier in the presentation, and we expect about 8 pounds per foot of kelp at the end of the season, which would be a pretty robust harvest, and 1 knot of current, that would generate 1,000 pounds of drag. And I'm figuring that out by using a number of different calculations in the background. But essentially knowing that 1,000 pounds of drag is essential to knowing the holding power that you need. So that amount, again, that amount of drag, the 1,000 pounds, is the holding power that you'll want. And we've added in there a built-in safety factor. So now you know that you need 1,000 pounds of holding power per anchor. So if a fluke anchor has a 20-to-1 holding pound ratio, you'll divide that 1,000 pounds by 20, and you'll get a 50-pound fluke anchor. So that'll tell you that's how much, how heavy you want your fluke anchors to be if that is the anchor that you're going with. But by the same math, if you were to use a concrete block, you'll need a 2,000-pound concrete block because it loses half of its weight and water. So again, this is just how you would run these calculations to go about deciding what type of anchor system you might want to deploy. And the other factor that goes into choosing an anchor is scope. Scope is a ratio between length and depth. We base our scope off the depth of your site at mean high water, and then you'll have to make a couple small modifications if you have extreme tidal variation. And different anchors perform differently with different amounts of scope. So the larger your scope, the larger the footprint of your farm, and potentially the larger your lease costs. So here you can see that a fluke anchor might require a 5-to-1 scope, whereas a screw anchor, helical anchor, might only require 2-to-1 scope. So all this can be pretty overwhelming. We really recommend that you start by getting to know the site conditions and evaluating the types of anchors that will work in these conditions. Talk to farmers in your area, ask what they've had good luck with. Determine the anchor size that you think you'll need to meet the holding power requirements that you've calibrated, and then compare the requirements for setting and retrieving anchors of these size. For example, would you need to use a barge or other infrastructure to put the anchors that you've chosen in place? And deciding what type of anchor system to go with is a complex decision-making process, and ultimately you might have to make some trade-offs. So at this point, you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed. There are so many decisions that you'll need to make as you go about designing your farm, and there are even more aspects that I didn't touch on, such as choosing what type of buoys to use. Are you going to use chains or other hardware in your system? And all of these decisions can be confusing for a first-time farmer and an experienced farmer alike. So if you're confused, you want to start a farm, but you're thinking, gosh, what am I supposed to do? How much is this going to cost? Where do I go next? Well, GreenWave has been working on an online tool to help farmers make decisions and plan your farm. We are developing with some partners an interactive farm design tool. It is the first of many components of an online farmer platform and farming community that we hope to build out in the near future. And currently the design tool is in its beta form. And essentially the notion is that it allows prospective kelp farmers to design a single line or a 5-line array system to grow sugar kelp. The way that it works is you input details about your site, including the current speed, the depth, and other factors that would influence your design. And then the tool will run some calculations and give you recommendations for your anchor size, the array design, and the farm layout that would fit within your site characteristics. Based off of the inputs that you give it, it will then generate some diagrams, including a cross-sectional diagram like the one on the left, a farm plan view like the one in the middle. And you could use these diagrams as you get started in the permitting process. It will also generate a budget based on the design and the state that you're operating in, and provide some basic leasing and permitting resources like links to map viewers that are relevant in your state, site planning tools, and state-specific permitting guidance. So if you're interested in volunteering to test drive this tool and provide feedback to our team as we're making tweaks and changes, you can send an email to team@greenwave.org. And in the subject heading, just throw in beta testing, volunteer, or something around beta testing, and tell us a little bit about where you are in the planning process, and we will add you to the list of people who are kind of helping us do this fine-tune feedback process. But we're aiming to release the tool for a wide audience later this spring. Okay, so at this point, you've designed your farm, you've sourced your seed, you've outplanted, you tended it through the winter, and now come spring, you're ready to harvest your crop. So every farmer goes about harvesting slightly differently, depending on the layout of their boat and what they plan to do with the kelp. But in general, harvest happens by retrieving the grow line from the water and cutting the kelp blade off just above the holdfast. I hear if you're Mike Dole, you might just pull the kelp off the long line without cutting it. And others are experimenting with removing the entire grow line from the system with the kelp still attached. How you harvest will be determined ultimately by where you plan to sell your crop. For example, farmers who are targeting the restaurant market will hand pick juvenile blades, cutting off any discolored or ratty ends, and being really careful not to squish the kelp by harvesting with too much bulk at any one time. And those who are selling for fertilizer may be able to be a little bit rougher and faster with their harvest. They might leave all the fouling on the blade because it could add soil nutrient benefit. So this begs the question, you have all this beautiful kelp ready to harvest, where will you sell it? In an ideal world, we recommend identifying your market and your sales strategy before you outplant, so you know when and how to harvest to suit your different buyers. But even if you have a market in mind, will it take all of your product? The answer is probably not. And so we really recommend taking a whole leaf strategy to marketing your kelp. Think about the different ways you can get value out of different parts of the kelp, salvage value if you have a low quality harvest, and in general, just diversify your sales streams. At the moment, the beautiful portion of the kelp blade is generally being used as a food product. It's sold in either a fresh or frozen form, potentially processed into a specialty food like pickles or kelp kimchi, or used as an ingredient in a more highly processed consumer good, such as the kelp burger or kelp jerky produced by Akua. And then there are other non-food uses for other parts of the kelp, including the stipe, the holdfast, and less appealing parts of the blade. And these may be converted into agricultural fertilizer and compost, which Mike and Chris will speak to later on, or potentially used as a plastic alternative product input. So each of these uses has different value and will put your product at a different price point, depending on who you're selling to and what they're going to use that kelp for. So again, we really recommend that when you're thinking about your sales strategy, you're developing a product mix. Based off our experience and interviews with farmers throughout the region, here's a breakdown of tiers that we're seeing for different types of kelp products sold to different types of purchasers. Some farmers who have taken on the work of building relationships with chefs and direct marketing to restaurants are capturing a really top tier price for hand delivered small packages of nicely portioned baby kelp blades. But that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of legwork to make those relationships. It takes a lot of work to do all of that marketing and that outreach. And one restaurant can only take so much. So the key here, again, is to think about your whole harvest and where it's going to go. Probably it's not going to go to one place. So where can you diversify your sales strategy? Where can you recoup the most value from your entire crop by looking to move different portions of your crop to different markets? So here we would see, again, that top tier layer would be those restaurants or those direct consumers where the farmer has done all of that hard work of the marketing. A farmer might be running their own CSA or CSF, community supported fishery or community supported agriculture. That might provide a higher value. You might be selling it as an ingredient wholesale that would go into a value added product. And you might be able to move slightly more of your kelp at that level. And then the lowest price point you're probably going to see is if it's going into a compost wholesale or being used for agricultural fertilizer, but you might be able to move quite a bit of kelp, and it might be a place where you would be able to offload some of that lower quality kelp. So at Greenwave, we recognize that post-harvest processing, the time after the kelp comes out of the water, is still a bottleneck in the industry, and it's something that we're actively working to solve. Some things that we want you as the farmer to be aware of is that the USDA treats kelp as a raw agricultural commodity up until the point it is processed, and it is not classified as a seafood product. This means that certain types of handling, such as trimming, cleaning, drying in an open air environment, like on your farm, in a greenhouse, in a tobacco barn, like we're doing this past year in Connecticut, and you can see in this picture on the slide. Those are not considered processing activities. Those are considered farming activities, and they do not require the use of permitted food safe facilities to be under federal standards to do those things. But caveat, we want you to understand that additional state and local regulations may go above and beyond those federal standards. And it's important to know what regulations are present in your area. Currently, in New York, because the industry is so new, these regulations are still in development. And at the moment, there aren't any from New York State to our knowledge. So for New York farmers, ultimately, your local town or your city health inspector would have the final say over those processing concerns. But the takeaway here is that this classification of kelp being a raw agricultural product, raw agricultural commodity, allows more flexibility in handling of your kelp after it comes out of the water than, say, with shellfish, if some of you are farming oysters, and that would have much stricter regulations. I also want to mention that Greenwave is working with an organization called the Crop Project that we're quite excited about. They are a startup that is angling to become the first independent processor and broker of seaweed in the Northeast. And this year, they're currently operating in a pilot phase with a limited number of farmers. But their model is essentially to buy raw kelp from the dock, do some form of preliminary processing, and then pass on that kelp to companies who are making other value-added goods. And this opportunity we think is really exciting because it would give farmers and buyers more time flexibility in syncing up between when the kelp is ready to come out of the water and when the buyer is ready to purchase that input for their product. But as I mentioned, and as you probably know, there is still a great need for more affordable kelp processing infrastructure in southern New England. And in order to address this, Greenwave has recently applied for and received a grant from the USDA. This grant has 3 components, but they're all dedicated towards developing more independent processing capacity for sales channels for kelp in southern New England. The first is we're going to be working with seafood processors to try and add kelp processing to their existing rotation of products. We're working with co-packers like Harvest Kitchen, which is an organization in Rhode Island, to create shelf-stable value-added food products. And the idea here is that you as a farmer could drop off your raw kelp to Harvest Kitchen or another co-packer, and then come pick it up later once they have processed it into a shelf-stable format. And then you would be able to resell it under your own brand name. So for example, Harvest Kitchen might say, make you a case of pickles. And then you would come back and rebuy from them at a lower price, a case of pre-jarred pickles that you would be able to re-sticker, rebrand, and do your own marketing and outreach, but on a longer time frame because that's a shelf-stable project. And then we're also conducting research into the shelf life and packaging that's appropriate for raw sugar kelp. To do this, we've partnered with Q Fresh Labs, who are a national expert in fresh produce packaging. And we're going to use their expertise to determine how fresh kelp can last longer so that we can broaden its distribution. Currently, we've identified that a standardized packaging system that's recognized by wholesale buyers is really a limiting factor in being able to sell kelp more broadly. So we're working with our partners at Q Fresh Labs to help and try and address that issue. So there may be no one golden ticket, but we are beginning to see movement in different markets in southern New England and increased interest from buyers in New York State. Our board member, Sean Barrett of Dock to Dish, has recently launched a campaign titled Eat More Kelp and is hoping to incorporate New York grown kelp into his community supported fisheries model that he runs at Dock to Dish. There's interest in multiple avenues for using kelp as land-based input for agriculture in New York, as Mike will speak to later on. And we're also currently investigating the potential for farmers to participate in a nutrient trading credit that could be so that they could be compensated for the ecosystem services that their kelp farm provides. So while many of these avenues and sales channels are really still in their nascent stages, just starting out, we believe that there's big potential for this market to grow. But while it is growing, our advice is just to start small, really learn the ropes, get good at farming, try it out, build connections in your region with other farmers, with potential buyers, and get your local food network figured out, and then really grow from there. And if you're interested in learning more about the sales and marketing aspect to kelp farming, I wanted to bring to your attention that on February 10th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, Greenwave will be hosting a webinar specifically on marketing and sales guidance, and it will be targeted towards kelp farmers in southern New England. This is part of our FMPP USDA grant that I mentioned earlier, really trying to develop those post-harvest sales channels. So the webinar will be led by our Market Innovation Program lead, Sam Garwin. She'll be presenting on some basic sales and marketing concepts, and then she'll talk directly about what are best practices for selling your kelp directly to consumers, directly to restaurants, to non-food markets. There'll be like a practitioner perspective from Cottage City Oysters, and then there'll be lots of time for question and answers. So if you have lots of questions about this topic, please sign up. The link is here at the bottom of the screen, bit.ly/kelp sales, and that will route you to a registration link for the webinar on February 10th. And with that, yeah, we'll take any questions. And a quick reminder, if you're designing a kelp farm and you do want to trial GreenWave's farm design tool, shoot an email to me at lindsay@greenwave.org or team@greenwave.org, and we will put you on the list and get you set up to trial that out. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Kendall. That was amazing. A very deep dive into the details for farmers, which I think they're all going to want. And for those of you who didn't know, we're recording this, and so we will post this on YouTube or a similar venue. So as people maybe forget one knot or another knot or the weight to line ratio, they can go back and look at that. But thank you so much for that great information. People with questions can put them in the chat, and I have some questions here already, so I'm going to read them out. We'll see how many we can get through. We don't want to run too long here, with Mike on tap being next. The first question is, can you translate pricing tiers to dollar ranges?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that. And actually, before I translate that, I just want to plug one more time. I messed up the Google form link earlier, so a lot of people weren't able to access it. I just dropped it back in the chat box. We've got 34 responses. I'd love to see all 124 people who are on fill that out and let us know a little more about yourself. To translate the pricing tiers, there's really a range of prices that kelp farmers are able to get depending on where they're selling their product and how much work and kind of marketing work they're doing. We've seen as low as 50 cents a pound and as high as $20 a pound. And there's just a huge spectrum. That lower end tier though is really about 50 cents to $2, and that higher top tier price with the higher margin for the farmer is the one where we've seen, $8, $10 to $20. But there's a lot of kind of context and nuance that goes along with that too. As Lindsay mentioned in the presentation, that top tier price often is something that a farmer can get if they're doing a lot of work in marketing and sales and building a brand for themselves, and then able to have a consistent product that they're bringing to market. There are also instances where with that really high price point, we're working with some farmers who are doing, baby leaf crops. So they're culling the kelp off of their long line early in the growing season when it's quite small and selling it to restaurants as a salad green, essentially. And they're getting a really high price per pound, but the number of pounds that they're selling in that case might be a lot lower than what you'd see at the very end of the season. So again, the margin's going to be different depending on the amount of work, brand building and brand recognition that you have as a farmer, but also kind of what outlet you're selling it to, how it's going to be utilized and processed. If you are trying to basically harvest your whole crop at the end of the season and turn it over to a processor who's going to do all that work for you, your margin's going to be a lot lower. And I would say that's where you see, in Maine, where farmers are getting 50 cents to $1, in southern New England, quite starting to get a bit more around, $1, $2 or more, depending on how that's being processed and utilized and where it's going.
Okay, question here about higher than normal levels of arsenic and metals in kelp from the sound. And the question is, have we tested any of the Long Island grown kelp from last year? I know the testing of the Long Island kelp is in progress, but Kendall, do you want to speak to trace metals in kelp?
Yeah, I can speak to that. First and foremost, and something that we didn't mention in the site evaluation portion of this presentation is that when we're working with new farmers to identify sites, we're often looking at places that are approved or conditionally approved for shellfish farming. So that's a kind of first order. Second is our crops are tested. We collect samples and submit those for sampling before we're allowed to sell. So about 2 weeks before our first harvest, we have to collect and submit kelp samples. All of the kelp crops that we've grown and the farmers that we're working with in Long Island Sound have had, food grade crops that we're growing. I saw a question in the chat box about, can you farm around Manhattan or like in New York waters? Would someone want to buy that kelp to eat or for something else, I think would be a question. One of the first kelp farms though in this region, and in fact, when we got our start at Greenwave, we were working with Dr. Charles Yarish, and another pilot site was in the Bronx River estuary. That kelp that was extensively tested for trace metals and nutrient content, including nitrogen from sewage treatment plants. For example, trace nitrogen from sewage treatment plants was found to also be within FDA standards for food consumption. But whether you could brand that, I think would be a little different. And that was a limited study that would, I think need more years of testing in order to verify those. There are folks at SUNY Maritime who are testing kelp in New York waters right now with some other partners as well. So there's a lot that we still have to learn, but I guess the point being, we look for sites that are approved or conditionally approved. We do submit samples, especially if we're using for food products.
Okay, maybe we'll do one more. We will get to answer all questions, but maybe via chat rather than orally. And so there is a question, this one looks like it could be important. For smaller farms, especially those not able to sell seaweed, can we have access to grants to buy seaweed seedlings without having to give equity or percent of our profit, especially as the process to grow them requires a lot of equipment? How about that one?
So if I can repeat, and I think that this was about buying seaweed seedlings, maybe this is a place to make a plug for Greenwave programming, but also to talk about, a good transition into the work that you're doing, Mike, on Long Island. We run a hatchery in New Haven in the Fairhaven neighborhood, and Lindsay mentioned that we produced 198 spools, about 7.5 miles of seed string this past year. The way that we structure our programming and historically is we've provided seed string for free to people who have gone through our program and then applied to receive seed string. We wait until those farmers kind of graduate into successful operation before we start charging for seed. We do have a pricing structure. And for people who haven't gone through our training, we also have that sort of price list available. But in the past, we've been trying to encourage the growth of the industry. And so part of that is being able to grow and provide seed to emerging farmers. And part of that is being able to support Stony Brook University with your hatchery and own operations so that you can start to provide for farmers in New York.
Okay. So just in the interest of making sure this isn't a 6-hour seminar, I think what we'll do, Kendall, if you and Lindsay could, maybe you could pick off the questions in the chat and answer those. If you could stop sharing, Lindsay, we're going to then turn it over to Mike, and I'll let Mike Dole, who's really done all of he's the pioneer in getting kelp onto oyster farms in New York. He did it first and started the first kelp hatchery. And really it's been the master of setting this all up. So I think we'll for those of you specifically in New York, you're about to learn a lot about the New York experience. So Mike, whenever you're able to, go ahead and I I'd say pull up your slides and we'll get to your presentation. And again, people can, if they have questions as we move along, they can put them in the chat. We'll seek to get to every single question, either answering it live or just via chat. So whenever you're ready, Mike, go ahead and take it away. And hopefully unmute as well. Okay, I think you should be able to unmute.
There we go.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Lindsay, thank you for such an incredible presentation. That was amazing. That was awesome. Before I begin, so this section, we're going to talk about, as Chris said, farming kelp in New York waters and what we've learned over the past 3 seasons here. And before I begin, hold on one second, I'm having a little.
Looks great here.
Looks great, but it's not advancing.
Well, okay, then you might need to unshare and try again, maybe.
Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody. Give me one second here. Okay, can you see that?
Not yet.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
So before I begin, I also just want to acknowledge and personally thank some of the incredible people and organizations I got to work side by side with over the last 3 years. First, the team at Green Wave, they've been our kelp collaborators from the beginning, and they've taught me and the Global Lab basically how to grow kelp, everything from the hatchery setup all the way through field grow out. It's been a great experience and a fun experience with Green Wave. I'd like to thank all the amazing oyster farmers that I've had a chance to work side by side with and partner with over the last 3 years. The list now is up to 10 farms that we've helped to seed kelp on, and the list is growing. And one of the things that I've tried to do as part of this project is transfer what I've learned from Green Wave to the farmers and here on Long Island. And in the process, I think I've learned more from them than I've taught. So thank you all. And also must thank the small army of environmental warriors that we call the Global Lab. About 20 plus members, and I think everyone in some way has helped and participated in these kelp projects. And in particular, I want to thank Brooke Morell. She's been our hatchery manager for the last 2 years, and the success of the hatchery has really been because of her. And also Marissa Velasquez, who's been our main diver and has been brave enough to go diving in 42-degree water and to install anchors or retrieve kelp. And the two of them are also a big part of the monitoring program that we do. So, but everybody in the Global Lab, thank you. And as Chris mentioned, our funders and where the fundings come from, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today on the farming end was funded through the USDA Specialty Crop Grant Program and the New York Farm Viability Institute. So to jump into it now, just to give you an outline, I'm first just going to give an overview of mariculture or marine farming in New York to show you where we're at now. And then the challenges facing sugar kelp farming in New York waters. And then what we've learned over the last 3 years about cultivating kelp in New York with the focus on shallow water kelp farming. This is one of the challenges that we addressed it, and this is going to be the heart of the talk, what I'll focus on mostly. And then hopefully with time remaining, I'm just going to touch a little bit on markets and permitting at the end. But to start with an overview, mariculture in New York right now is focused pretty much on one crop, and that's oysters. In 2019, there were 50 farms reporting production, 50 shellfish farms reporting productions. They landed about 6 million oysters. There is one farm that grows clams, but that's it. And right now, there is no seaweed farming in New York. No kelp or not any type of seaweed. These 50 farms are all small owner-operated farms. The farms are 10 acres or less in size. The farms, if they have any employees, it's usually less than 10 employees. A lot of them are family farms. So this is a real mom and pop industry with small farms, and they're located in estuaries all around Long Island. And the concentrations of these farms are where there's public leasing programs. So the biggest leasing program is in the Peconic Estuary. That's the Suffolk County Aquaculture Leasing Program. Then the next biggest is in the town of Islip in the Great South Bay. The town of Brookhaven in the South Shore also has a leasing program. I think there's 4 farmers now in that leasing program. And then up in our largest estuary on the North Shore, in Long Island Sound, there's not a leasing program, but these are state waters that are controlled by the state, and you can get temporary marine area use assignments, of which there's a couple now where I have shaded up there in the Sound. And amongst all these farms, there's a growing interest in farming sugar kelp as a means to diversify crops, to create added revenue streams, and to further improve water quality. And there's a lot of good reasons farmers in New York want to start growing sugar kelp. First we see our neighbors in the states to the north are growing sugar kelp, even as close as Connecticut, which Lindsay pointed out. And this is a photo right from Long Island Sound from Bren's farm. Sugar kelp's indigenous here in Long Island waters, so we're not introducing a non-native species, and it should grow well here. As Lindsay's also pointed out, you can vertically integrate seaweeds and sugar kelp with shellfish. So you don't have to replace one crop for another. You don't have to replace oysters for kelp. You can grow them together and create added revenue streams. And then finally, one of the things that I think attracted me at first most to kelp was that it has an opposite growing season from oysters. So when you're oyster farming, most of your labor is spent during the warmer months when the oysters are growing and the biofouling happening. But in the winter, things slow down, and you can divert labor and resources from oysters in the summer to kelp in the winter. And you can turn seasonal employees into year-round employees. So these are all really good reasons for an oyster farmer to grow kelp. But it's not happening yet in New York. And so I just want to give you a quick overview of the 4 main challenges. I broke it down into 4 challenges facing kelp farming in New York. First is uncertainties about being able to grow it in New York waters. A lot of farms in New York are located in shallow waters, particularly on the South Shore of Long Island up here in Great South Bay and Mauritius Bay. As Lindsay pointed out, kelp farming is traditionally done in deep waters. The Kelp Farming Manual recommends waters greater than 18 feet deep. And pretty much every farm in the country right now is in waters about that. Kelp farm is in waters about that deep. And here on the South Shore of Long Island, deep water here is 10 feet. And in a lot of cases, a lot of the farms are in waters that you can stand in. So starting into this, there was a belief that really a lot of Long Island was not accessible for kelp farming because of water depth. So that's one thing we wanted to address. Which has also been pointed out, there's a limited availability of seed stock. So in order to do this research, that was another challenge we had to address, was seed stock. Also, the local markets are really unknown, and there's a limited availability of processors. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the talk. And there's a lot of regulatory and legal hurdles going from the jurisdiction of where you want to grow water to the federal level at the Army Corps of Engineers, and then the state level of at the New York State DEC. I am stuck again, unfortunately. Okay, excuse me, everybody, for 1 second. There we go. Okay. Yes, I'm not going to be able to cover all of this today. We need a workshop for each of these individual challenges, and I'm really going to focus on cultivating kelp in shallow waters. That's going to be the main focus and what we've found over the last 3 years. But in order to fuel this research, we needed to create seed stock. And in 2019, we set up the first New York State DEC permitted kelp hatchery in the state. We set this up in a dedicated environmental chamber that's temperature controlled. As I mentioned at the beginning, GreenWave taught us how to do this. So there was a technology transfer from GreenWave to set up this hatchery. And we've had 2 successful seasons so far, producing about 45 spools per year. And then we use these seed spools to fund our field cultivation trials over the last 3 years. So in the 2019 season, we've seeded 3 farms, one in Great South Bay on a lease from the town of Islip, at the Great Gun Shellfish Farm in Mauritius Bay, and at the East End Oyster Farm up in Long Island Sound. I apologize, the stutter is because for whatever reason, it might be a bandwidth issue, but I'm not, slides aren't moving too good here. And I apologize. Man. Okay. I'm going to have to stop share for a minute, and I apologize. Let me just try again. All right, let's try it again. Okay, in 2020, we seeded 4 more farms. Again, we moved in Great South Bay. We moved to another farm, Lucky 13 Oysters, Great Gun Shellfish again. And then in the Peconic Estuary on a privately owned property, Widow's Hole Oyster Farm and Fisher's Island Oyster Farm up in Long Island Sound. And in 2021, we've upped it to 7 more farms. In 2021, we just started seeding farms in the Peconic Estuary within the Suffolk County Aquaculture Leasing Program, 5 farms there. And again, we're working in the South Shore Estuary with Great Gun Shellfish and Lucky 13 Oysters. Now, we picked these locations to focus on areas where there's a concentration of aquaculture within these leasing programs, but we also selected farms to get a range of water depths. So at the Great Gun Farm in Mauritius Bay, low tide water depths are about 2 feet. In Great South Bay at the Lucky 13 Oyster Farm, we set up lines in different water depths ranging from 3 to 10 feet. And then we set up lines in deeper waters in Long Island Sound. Waters are that we set up in were typically about 20 feet. And the 5 sites in the Peconic Estuary ranged from about 8 to 20 feet. Now I'm going to kind of just give away the punchline right here, and just to say that we've had success in all water depths across Long Island and in all estuaries. Shallow waters, deep waters. And what I'd like to do now is just describe to you how we've grown kelp in these different waters, how much we were able to grow. and interesting differences that we see between sites and between areas with different water depths. So in our deeper waters, and by deeper, I just mean greater than 4 feet, okay? Greater than 4 to 5 feet. We set up suspended long line systems as Lindsay described. There's a diagram up here. This is courtesy of Jason Masters, a farmer we're working with in the Peconic Estuary. But the lines are anchored at either side. They're suspended with buoys in the water column. And in some of the Long Island Sound setups, the longest lines we set up were a little over 200 feet. And so in this bottom picture here, you can see from the surface a string of 5 buoys. Here you see the line lifted out of the water. Depending on the site, we've used all different types of anchors customized for the site. In Great South Bay, we use 200-pound mushroom anchors. In Peconic Estuary, we use 300-pounders. In Long Island Sound, we used 500 pounds. We've also put in screw down anchors at a bunch of sites. But when you're in deeper waters, that does require scuba. And so if you don't do scuba, that could be expensive. This was a big part of the labor right here, is getting these lines, the anchors installed, the moorings and the lines in these deep waters. I want to give a shout out to Peconic Gold Oysters. This past season in Peconic Estuary, they've been a tremendous help putting in moorings, and some of the moorings we've put in there. And then once the anchor's in, you seed the lines. Now, typically, I'm going to just play a little video right now just to show the seeding and process. But this is at Barley Dunn site in the Peconic Estuary. So this is some recent video of seeding the lines there. With these deeper water sites, we typically use a crew of 3. So after the line's set up, we put the seed spool on one side. We have one guy pull the boat down the rope, one person hold the seed spool in the middle, and then one person making the string goes on and then tying the knots as we stop along the way. So the video just gives you a little perspective of the process. It's not hard, but it definitely, you could do it with 2 people, but 3 people we found is really helps. And then in shallow waters, now here's waters that are less than 4 feet. We customized a different system. And this is as opposed to a suspended line system, this is a staked line system. So if I could just walk you through my crude diagram up here. We put screw down anchors in, okay? Take 4 to 5 foot screw down anchors and you screw them in 3 to 4 feet. So it's, they're sticking up about 1 foot above the bottom. This brown dotted line is supposed to indicate the sediment bottom, and this blue line up top is the water surface. So we stake the lines about a foot to 2 feet above the bottom. And, you know, that's it. The picture down here, this shows a screw down anchor with a pigtail attach. And you can see that in the diagram up here. Here's the screw down anchor with a pigtail attach and your long line attaching to the pigtail. Kind of just to quickly walk you through step by step and just show you how easy it is. First, you attach the pigtails to the anchors. I typically have used thimbles and shackles to do this. Getting a little more jiggy this year and just tying the pigtail on direct with an anchor knot. So no hardware. It's really not necessary because we're talking about a 5-month growing season, and tying the pigtail right onto the anchor is fine. Then you screw down the anchors in at both sides. You tie the kelp line onto the pigtail with the bowline knot, and then you stretch the line down to the other end and you tie on down there. So next is to put the seed spool on, and that's just about as easy. You go to one end, you untie the kelp long line, and you put the seed spool through the line. You tie the line back on with a bowline knot. You tied the seed string next through the braid of the rope, okay? And the FID helps to do that, to get you through the braid of the rope. And then you walk the seed spool down the line. And I show this video just to compare and just to show you how easy it is in simple water. I mean, this operation can be done with one person, and to go down a 100-foot line takes about 1 minute. and that's it. So I'm not going to play this. I won't play this video to the end, but that's about as easy as it is. When you get to the other end, you just cut the seed string off the spool. You retie the seed string through the braid at that end. An important part is just getting the line really tight. And to do that, we put a trucker's hitch in, pull the line super, super taut. And then you just check to make sure the line's tight and not touching the bottom. And you can see in this underwater video, just going down the line, we'll pass our trucker's hitch there. Then you can see the seed string just starting, but you go down that 100 feet of line and it is super tight and it's staked about 1 foot above the surface. So there's several advantages of stake lines. One thing I just pointed out is how easy it was to do it. Second, there's no buoys at all. You don't have, at least for a 100-foot line, we did not need to use buoys to suspend the line at all. We were able to get it tight. If you need to retighten during the season, you can go down to that trucker's hitch, loosen it, and just pull it a little tighter and tighten it back up. There's also no mooring lines, okay? So you don't need anchors, or you don't need big mooring anchors. You don't need chain. You don't need the mooring lines, all the hardware that goes with it. And with no buoys, with no anchors, you have lower gear and labor cost, okay? The cost of this 100-foot staked kelp line, all in with everything, is $88, okay? That doesn't include the seed, but the rope, the hardware, the anchors is $88 for the line. An equivalent length line in a deep water system, now this is just a single line, but an equivalent length line in a deep water system using 300-pound mushroom anchors, buoys, and mooring lines would be about $1,600. Okay, so 18-time difference in price right there. So next, I just want to talk a little bit about crop yields and how much we were able to grow with these different methods. I'll start off with a quick visual, you can see the dates. Okay, so this line was seeded in December, near the end of December. So within the first 3 weeks, we noticed about 6 inches of growth. It starts off kind of slow, a few more inches by February, and then come March, you really start seeing a growth, and then April, it just takes off. Now, this was from Moriches Bay, okay, which is one of the sites. But just to give you an idea of how fast it grows and how big it grows. And to show you this in terms of data, we take samples at time points along the way. And in these figures here, I just want to compare the growth of our shallow water site, Moriches Bay, to our deep water site in Long Island Sound. This is data from 2019. The top graph is just showing the weight in terms of pounds per foot of line over time. And the bottom one is the blade length over time. And at both sites in Moriches Bay and in Long Island Sound, we were able to get peak biomass yields of around 4 pounds per foot. Also in both bodies of water, we were able to grow the blades up to about 5 feet. But you'll see really interesting differences in the growth patterns between the shallow and deep water. In our shallow water site, growth took off much quicker and then leveled off and actually started to decline. And it took a while in deeper waters for the growth to pick up. But it did catch up eventually. And you'll see peak biomass in the shallow waters in 2019 anyway. We reached that in the latter half of April. And then we started seeing a decline in biomass. And that was due to a degradation in the kelp blades. So if you can see in these top pictures, I just have a picture of some kelp blades in April, and you can see for the most part the blades are intact all the way down to the tip. They were very clean, beautiful color. And then just several weeks later in May, we started seeing massive degradation of the kelp blades. You see senescence at the blade tips, a lot of grazing, a lot more fouling. By mid-May, the kelp was no longer of a food quality, and this degradation happened as the water temperature started to increase above about 11, 12 degrees Celsius, which you can see, this is a continuous temperature plot down here at the bottom, but we've started really seeing the degradation when the water temperatures got to about 11, 12 degrees Celsius. In the deeper waters, however, the degradation was delayed, and we had strong growth through June in Long Island Sound. In June, we really didn't see much fouling or grazing. We did start seeing some senescence at the blade tips, which could be cut off, and the kelp could still be usable as food at this point. And part of the reason for this extended growing season, the Sound, one is water temperature. So the deeper waters warm up a lot slower than the shallow waters. And also the waters are deep, so there's a lot less organisms that could graze on the kelp when the waters do warm up. So we've got a much longer growing season in Long Island Sound in 2019. Looking at the data from 2020, again, these plots are just showing growth in terms of weight over time and length over time for multiple sites and treatments that we did in 2020. I won't get into the details of each site, but I just want to say we had really an incredible year in 2020. Across sites, we had peak biomass yields that ranged between 3 to 9 pounds per foot. Again, we had the highest growth in Moriches Bay, which is this blue line. And so we more than doubled the growth in Moriches Bay in 2020. We got up to 9 pounds a foot. Individual kelp blades up to 12 feet long in 2020. If you want to know what a 12-foot kelp blade looks like, I had to get up on a ladder to have this picture taken, but there you go. That is a 12-foot kelp blade. So very interesting comparison if we look just at Moriches Bay between the 2 years, 2019 and 2020. We had a much longer growing season in 2020 that brought us to these much higher crop yields. Whereas in 2019, the kelp started degrading in mid-April. Growth continued through April, May, all the way into early June in 2020 in Moriches Bay. And again, if you look at the water temperatures, I think these differences between years can be explained by water temperature. If you look at that critical time period between mid-April and mid-May, water temperatures on average were 2 degrees Celsius lower in 2020 than 2019. So we think those lower temperatures in 2020 helped extend the growing season and resulted in much larger crop yields. So now that we have this data from a couple years, we can make some estimates of the amount of biomass a farm can produce. And so for an example, and we could do this for every one of our farm sites, but for an example, we're going to use the Moriches Bay farm site, where we had the highest yields. And based on what we've done, we think we can, on a 1 acre plot, we think we can easily space lines 5 feet apart. Okay. Building out a full system, that will left to be seen, but we think we could do 5 feet apart. A 1 acres is about 208 feet by 208 feet. So if we make the lines 200 feet, we can put about 40 200-foot lines in at 5 feet spacing. Now, if we then assume 4 to 9 pounds per foot at peak biomass, and that's based on our data from over the 2 years, that comes out to 800 to 1,800 pounds per line. And if we multiply that by our 40 lines, we estimate that 32,000 to 72,000 pounds of kelp can be produced per acre in Moriches Bay. Really just a mind-blowing, a phenomenal amount of biomass can be produced on just 1 acre. And so, coming into this study, we approached it as these shallow water environments of being a limitation for New York farmers, as possibly being a detriment for New York farmers. And in the end, this may be an asset and maybe an advantage for you, for New York farmers. And we've found, we could grow it in shallow waters, and we can grow a lot of it in shallow waters. That kind of brings into the next question is markets, and something Lindsay had brought up previously is like, where are farmers going to now sell all this kelp? And I made this slide. This is a summary of the table that Lindsay showed. I'm talking about those different tiers of sales channels for farmers. And at the top tier, where you can get your highest dollar value would be food at a retail value, whether it's at farmer markets, online sales. And then your next tier would be selling food at a wholesale level, whether seafood distributors, restaurants, community supported fisheries. And then at a lower dollar amount, you can sell it as an ingredient to processors and companies that make value-added products, whether it be fertilizers or skincare products, biopackaging, biofuels. There's an incredible amount of markets that seaweeds can feed as a raw ingredient. And at the bottom tier, compost, compost as wholesale. And so there's a trade-off with the price. You can get top dollar with retail, but there's only so much you're going to be able to sell, especially at 5 to 10 pounds a shot. It would take a real lot of sales to get to 72,000 pounds. So, you can sell some there at a high price. So the trade-off with price is volume. And down at these wholesale ingredients, the processors and compost wholesale, you might get a lower price, but a lot more volume can be moved. So a couple considerations for New York. It's a short harvest season. I put April to May. You may be able to extend it into June in deeper water and in good years, but really before it starts degrading, you have a limited window from April to May. So that's a limited window for farmers to sell kelp fresh and direct. And we can grow an incredible amount of biomass. Okay, so you have a short harvest season where you can grow a lot of biomass, and you take this together, we need processors, and we need buyers who can buy large quantities of kelp, can process it and shelf stabilize the kelp. And that right now in New York is a limitation. And this, I believe this is the biggest bottleneck to growth for the kelp industry, not just in New York, but in general. It's not the ability to grow it. We've shown that we can grow it. We can grow a lot of it. It's the ability to process it and stabilize it to be able to sell into these other markets. And that's where the bottleneck and limitation is right now. But there is help on the way. And I just want to share with you a couple organizations that I've had the pleasure to get to know and work with over the last couple of years that are opening up potential new markets for New York farmers. First, Lindsay has already mentioned before, Eat More Kelp. And Sean Barrett, the founder for Eat More Kelp, also the founder for Dr. Dish. So I think many of you might know Sean from Dr. Dish. But Eat More Kelp's mission is to drive solutions to the climate crisis by encouraging everyone to eat more ocean farmed kelp. They got a great online store now where if you want to buy some great kelp merchandise, you can go there. But what's really exciting is this spring and summer, they're going to pilot the world's first community-supported kelp crop project and begin distributing locally grown sea greens directly to home cooks in Long Island. So that's a new market that will be opening up on Long Island that farmers will be able to sell into. Lindsay had also mentioned the Crop Project and Casey Emmett from the Crop Project. This is a new startup business in New York. They're an agricultural processing and wholesale company, and they're devoted to bringing regenerative crops to market like kelp. They're currently working with Greenwave, and they're drying large amounts of kelp in tobacco sheds in Connecticut. This is definitely somebody to reach out to moving forward. I'm very excited about that. And I also just want to mention Casey from the Crop Project has a lot of experience with bringing new regenerative crops to market. And he previously had founded, if you're familiar with chia bars. He had the Healthy Warrior Company. He had previously worked on these issues with a different crop, with chia seeds, and bringing, getting that, and a lot of analogies to that and where kelp is now. And so there's some really great people working to build these supply chains and these distribution channels for kelp. And then also our friends at Lazy Point Farms. And this is a relatively new organization that has started on Long Island. And their mission is to provide resources and support that lead to a sustainable and thriving farmer-driven kelp industry in New York State. You can learn more about them at their websites. They're currently right now helping farmers also getting going in New York waters. They're looking to help get processing going in New York, and they're looking to help connect farmers with markets. So this is going to be a tremendous resource for the New York marine farming industry moving forward. And to end the talk, we've got to give a few minutes to regulations and permitting. Some might put this at the top right now of the biggest obstacle of kelp farming in New York, because quite frankly, you can't do it. It's not legal, at least in some areas. And there's 3 different levels that I broke down to look at. You need jurisdiction approval of who owns the water or controls the water. Where in the South Shore, there's the jurisdiction's town governments like Town of Islip, Town of Brookhaven, and in the Peconic Estuary, it's Suffolk County, and Long Island Sound, it's state waters. So it gets really confusing, and different jurisdictions have different regulations in place right now. So you got to understand that. And then you need federal approval from the Army Corps of Engineers, and ultimately state approval from New York DEC, which a lot of oyster farmers are already familiar with. At this point, I hope Wade is still there. If Wade Carden from the New York State DEC is here, if we could switch over to Wade, Chris, if he's here. I hope he's here. And
yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, awesome, thanks. Yeah, Wade is. This is Wade Carden from the DEC. A lot of the farmers in New York that are here know Wade very well. He takes care of all our permitting, and I've asked Wade to come in and just give a DEC overview of where New York's at right now with seaweed permitting. Take it away, Wade.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Yeah, hi everyone. Just to give you a quick background about our agency for people who may not be familiar. In New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation has a Division of Marine Resources, where our office is located in East Setauket. We'll actually be moving to Kings Park this year. But anyway, the division is broken into 3 bureaus: fin fisheries and crustaceans, marine habitat protection, and shell fisheries. I'm the unit leader for the Shellfish Management Unit, and it's our office that is involved with the mariculture permitting program for the state, which, as Mike pointed out, is extremely oyster-centric. So we're typically just permitting oyster farms around Long Island, and also, as Mike pointed out, access is somewhat limited. The inland bays that would be most attractive to doing shellfish cultivation, I know there were some comments made about depth for kelp cultivation, but at least for shellfish, those inland bays are generally under the jurisdiction of the various Long Island towns, and to date, Islip and Brookhaven are really the only towns that have initiated formal licensing or leasing programs to get access to underwater lands to growers so they can begin farming shellfish. And then one of our largest access programs is the Suffolk County Aquaculture Lease Program out in Peconic and Gardner's Bays. That is actually state-controlled underwater land, but it was ceded to Suffolk County around 2009, 2010 for the purposes of shellfish leasing. So, and then Mike also mentioned state waters, that being we would cover Long Island Sound and Block Island Sound. So I'll start out with the state waters. New York State's laws only give our agency, the Department of Environmental Conservation, we only have the authority to do shellfish leasing. The law makes no mention of anything beyond shellfish, so it doesn't say aquaculture, it doesn't say mariculture. So we've never initiated a formal leasing program where we've done like a spatial analysis of Long Island Sound or Block Island Sound. So what we have is a temporary marine area use assignment program that is limited to cage-based shellfish farming only. So that's sort of the wrinkle where it comes in with that we're not able to provide access for kelp or seaweed cultivation. Even for shellfish, it's not a very popular program. I've only issued one temporary assignment in the last 5 years. I think, again, that just has a lot to do with Long Island Sound being a much different environment than the inshore bays like Peconic and Gardeners and the South Shore bays. So jumping down from state level to Suffolk County, as Mike mentioned, he's beginning a program with some of the growers that are in the Suffolk County leasing program. The section of state law that ceded control of those underwater lands to the county was amended in recent years to include a pilot scale kelp program, cultivation program, or seaweed cultivation program, and that is what Mike is collaborating with a few growers in that program on. That just got underway this year. And then at the town level, I mentioned Islip and Brookhaven. Islip's currently approximately 120 acre area east of Captree Island with about 21 to 5 acre leases. Again, very shallow area, as you saw in a lot of the, be the same kind of environment as the photos you saw Mike present. And then the town of Brookhaven has approximately 6 1 to 4 acre leases that have been leased to date. So at this point, we have had conversations with the Corps of Engineers, New York District. They have indicated that whether it's cultivating kelp for research projects or whether it's done commercially on farms, it does require a permit from the Corps of Engineers. As many of you may know, late last year there was some proposed revisions to the Corps' nationwide permits. There's the nationwide permit number 48 is what covers shellfish cultivation, but they didn't have anything that really spoke to cultivation of other organisms. So there is a proposed nationwide permit for seaweed cultivation forthcoming. Our agency did comment on that and commented favorably that we would be in support of it with, just with same sort of criteria we look for in shellfish projects. So at this point, if there were any of those growers in the town programs, Islip or Brookhaven, that really wanted to pursue producing kelp commercially on their farms, we could work with them and the other agencies with getting that permit. The permit from the Corps at this point is what they refer to as an IP or an individual permit. So so if any of those growers do want to take the plunge that far, many I know are collaborating with Stony Brook and other organizations just doing research and feasibility. But if they wanted to take it to the level where, they really would be producing it commercially, they could get in touch with us. And just to, in terms of, DEC would regulate the cultivation aspect, but certainly once you're getting to harvest and processing, that would no longer be us. That would be New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, as far as I could tell. If anyone else has any questions about regulatory, I'll try to answer them.
Thanks, Wade. And that's the end. And I just want to reiterate one thing Wade said. in the towns, the town of Brookhaven and town of Islip, in their aquaculture code permits seaweed aquaculture. So given that, right now, farmers in those areas can start applying for permits. Like Wade said, it's an individual permit to the Army Corps. It's not a nationwide permit yet, so it's a little more difficult, or it might take a little more time for approval. But I just want to be clear that farmers in the South Shore, in town of Brookhaven and town of Islip, can start applying for permits now. Okay, they can, if you're interested in growing in seaweed, there's nothing stopping you right now from applying for permits. You don't have to wait for this nationwide this new nationwide permit for seaweed. It will make things easier, but you can start now. And so Wade, thanks. And I am, going to open it up to questions, which Chris is going to moderate.
Yeah. And so again, people, I will, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll get through a few here. And those that we don't get through, we will answer directly. Mike, a first question came up with regard to the harvesting of baby kelp leaves, since that seems to be the ones that are of greatest interest for food grade. And the question was, is it possible you could harvest those twice in a single season?
Yes, great question. Because of time constraints, I actually cut those slides, but that is something that we've done and we've been playing with. As long as you cut the blades a couple inches down below the stipe, because up there, that's where the apical meristem, that's where the growth is going to take place from. You can cut the blades and they will regrow. And that complicates when you're making a financial model for this and a business model, that complicates things tremendously, right? So it's simple if you just have one time point and you say, oh, this is my peak biomass and this is how much I produce. And but you can cut it and it does grow back, and then you can cut it again. So yes.
Okay. I see one just popped up here about a pilot project in 3 Mile Harbor. Unfortunately, by the Gobler Lab, we had proposed that, but that was not funded by the town of East Hampton. So that's not going forward this year. But another question came from Barley, specifically about if you went really intensive on the kelp farming, what's the likelihood of shading? Can you go too intense that would lead to too much shading and then decrease yields?
So I'm sure there is a point where that would happen. When we mapped out a hypothetical farm design from Riches Bay and spacing those lines 5 feet, that is a concern. Maybe, is that too close? Are they, if the kelp is growing 12 feet long, I mean, what type of shading is going to happen there? So we did space, we have been spacing the lines though 6 to 8 feet, and the kelp grew tremendously. So so barley, I'm not 100% sure, I think there would be a density that would be too much, whether there be, might even be, nutrient competition if you're too close too, and light competition. But I don't have a clear answer of what is too much or what is too close. That's something I think you'll have to figure out as you're farming.
Okay, well, I guess a twofold question to Wade maybe. So Wade, if you're still there, first question I think is easy, and that is, what is the status of selling wild harvested kelp in New York? I think I know the answer, but I'm going to let a regulatory person give the answer.
It's unregulated.
Okay, so, all right. And then another question, Katie O'Brien, she actually had, Clayton actually had 2 questions. And the first one was for you, Wade, and that is, how does the Long Island Sound Study nutrient bioextraction work figure into DEC permitting and future regulations?
Certainly all of the information that's come out of any of the pilot studies going on currently and that have gone on in the past couple of years would inform that. But again, for anything to be spread into state waters beyond the existing, or really any waters, any jurisdictions around the island beyond where shellfish farming is currently, there's access for that. that requires a whole infrastructure and spatial planning aspect to make underwater lands available for mariculture in general.
Okay, and then just clarifying back to that first one, the question about selling it, the follow-up was, does that mean you can sell it? You said it was unregulated. Maybe you should clarify that.
Yeah, I view unregulated as there would be no regulation or law I'm aware of that would be cited to against someone selling wild harvested kelp.
All right. And let's just see. There was someone who couldn't type into the chat. I just gave them the opportunity to unmute and ask a question. I don't know if they're able to do that. They're still muted. You're still muted.
There we go. That should do it.
Yep.
So the applications, Army Corps Engineer application is found online. Is that correct?
That's for
We
you,
could
Rick.
forward it to you. Yeah, we could forward it to you.
Great. And an application from the DEC is also required.
Yes.
So these applications were obtained through you, Wade. Send you an email, ask you to forward us that information.
Correct.
Cost associated with the application, similar to the oyster?
Yeah, I mean, if you have an existing culture permit for the current year, the amendments to existing permits don't require a fee.
Okay.
So we wouldn't look at it as a separate permit. You would just be modifying your existing oyster farming permit to add seaweed or kelp cultivation.
Right, and I know that Mike from Woodless Hole Oysters asking about where you can get seed, and does Stony Brook sell seed? We produce seed. We don't currently sell it, but I think for future years we can think about how we can get it to as many people as possible. I'm gonna, in the interest of keeping on time, Mike, I'm gonna ask you to unshare. And I know we have more questions in the chat, and I'm going to ask Mike and Kendall to do their best to address those questions. And I'm going to seek to give my presentation now. We'll see how that goes. And here, tough act to follow. I'm batting cleanup. 2 great presentations. We're going to move to something new here because my presentation is going to focus on what I would call the environmental benefits of kelp farming. And so you can see the title, I'm up to the promise part. In this case, it's the promise of kelp aquaculture for improving water quality and fighting climate change and protecting bivalves. And hopefully I'll get to cover all of that. And I'll start out with the sort of theme that I've given on many of my talks. So you're going to see some slides you always see from me. And that is the eutrophication issue on Long Island and the fact that as our population has grown, the nitrogen in the groundwater that's discharging into our bays and estuaries, the concentrations keep going up. And we know why that is now, that it's coming from septic systems primarily and secondarily from fertilizer. And we know that in some ways, we're at, some people would call this a crisis point with regards to water quality impairment. This is a map that our lab made just documenting water quality between the months of June and September of 2020. And in most cases with regard, and what it's showing specifically are marine and freshwater harmful algal blooms and the occurrence of hypoxia or low oxygen conditions. And we're not making this up as our own call. We're using DEC standards and federal standards for the occurrence of these events. And so what you can see is that there are lots of water quality impairments, whether you go from Montauk all the way into Manhattan, you can see widespread North Shore, South Shore, East End. On that harmful algal bloom front, we've got many different types. You can see some that make toxins and others that are lethal to marine life. And we've documented in many studies during the past decade that when it comes to these harmful algal blooms, when you feed them more nitrogen, there are two potential outcomes. And sometimes you get both outcomes, and that is the events can become more toxic, more toxic, and that in the case of blue-green algae, and I'll talk about another one where that can happen, or they can become more intense. But either way, that's a threat to the environment and and a threat to aquaculture, frankly. And it's linked to the oxygen front as well. When you get those algal blooms, eventually they die off. And when that happens, you have the process of respiration. Oxygen is consumed. The DEC in New York State has very clear regulations on oxygen that levels ideally would be above 4.8 and would never go below 3.0. And in our monitoring over the last 5 years or so, what you can see is that many water bodies don't even make the lowest standard. Many others just make the lowest, but not the highest standard. And there's just a few that make that both standards throughout the summer. And so we have widespread low oxygen conditions. Now, beyond thinking locally about water quality impairment, I just want to momentarily talk about climate change. Maybe it's take a little bit of a back burner in 2020 with all sorts of other global issues. But whether it's in the front of our mind or not, climate change is real and it's here. And if you missed the news last week, 2020 set an all-time record for temperatures. And frankly, as a scientist, for me, that's scary because the prior record we had in 2016 was an El Nino year. And I don't have time to get into the oceanography of it, but you'd expect temperatures to be really hot during an El Nino year. 2020 was not an El Nino year. In fact, we had lower CO2 emissions. We actually were trending towards something called La Nina. And again, I can't get into the details of that, but still we hit an all-time record. And I find this figure here very important. Once in a while, if you listen to a climate denier, they'll say, oh, well, the NOAA model's no good. Well, here are 4 models all landing in the same exact space and coming with the same answer. And I'll note also this, there was a little bit of climate change in the 20th century, but look what's happened since 1980. We've gone up a full degree centigrade. That's remarkable. Along with this, we know that our oceans are holding less oxygen. And that was reviewed in this paper here. And you can see the global occurrence of low oxygen conditions. There are now, I believe, over 600 sites that have been documented across the globe. And as temperatures warm, our oceans hold less oxygen. In parallel, we also know that the levels of CO2 continue to rise in our atmosphere. Here are some readings just as of last May. Again, 2020 was supposed to be the time where we turned off the spigot because everybody was at home. This is a record that gets set year after year without fail. Temperature levels, there's some variability there, but 417 parts per million. You can see if you look at the x-axis here, pick out where you were when, and you can remember back to when the CO2 levels were maybe in the 300s or whatever, but they just keep going up. And we know how this is affecting our oceans. It's acidifying our oceans, and I'll talk more about that later. But I also want to emphasize that our coastal zones are already experiencing the acute effects of climate change, and not always just directly due to the global stressors. And so this is just an example from a paper we published a few years back. We called it Ocean Acidification, the Other Eutrophication Problem. Because what we documented in this paper is that in the Northeast US, and really now people recognize across the globe, when you have those conditions, so what you're showing this colorized plot here is Long Island Sound, depth profile going from New York City to Port Jefferson. And that red area is that dead zone or the hypoxic zone in Long Island Sound. So what we recognize is that anytime you have a low oxygen condition, you also have acidification. And you can see the parallel here. When you have high levels of oxygen, CO2 levels are low, and conversely, when you get a hypoxic zone, that's when you have high CO2. Why is that? Because just like we breathe in oxygen and out CO2, coastal ecosystems do the same thing. And that process is accelerated when you overload it with nutrients. And so when we think about different stressors in coastal zones, there's no shortage of them. Right? Usually I talk about just harmful algal blooms, but we need to recognize that that's not the only thing going on. We have, as I mentioned, the temperatures, low oxygen, and acidification all concurrently happening. And if you wanted a way to really remember what this is all about, you can maybe remember this. People tend to remember this when I show it. Here are the 4 horsemen of the ocean climate change apocalypse: warming, hypoxia or low oxygen, acidification, and harmful algal blooms. So with this dire look on what's going on in our ocean, in our coastal oceans, what is the role of seaweeds? Can they avert this apocalypse? And so that's what I'm going to talk about now. And specifically, I'll be focusing on kelp, of course. But I also want to mention that, we've been working with Green Wave and putting out kelp for the last 3 years or so. But for the last decade plus, we've been working on other seaweeds, things like gracilaria that we grow on ropes, and also ova, which can be grown, or sea lettuce, which can be grown on ropes or otherwise. So, how is it that seaweeds can possibly be affecting water quality? Well, we all know they're photosynthetic organisms. So what that means is that they're assimilating carbon dioxide. They have to assimilate nitrogen. And as being photosynthetic, they are respiring out, or they're letting off oxygen, not respiring oxygen. They're via the process of photosynthesis, releasing oxygen. We'll talk a little bit later about the fact that they are probably also secreting what we call secondary metabolites that may inhibit harmful algal blooms. And so first, just to talk about the nutrient front, I'm going to talk about the seaweed ulva again, just a very little experiment that we did last summer, just to show you the power of these seaweeds. When we set up, you can see 2 tanks here with and without seaweeds, not even packed that dense. This is from our marine lab, where we have lots of marine animals, and this is the outgoing water. So it can have some high levels of nitrogen from waste from fish or from shellfish. And you can see the tank that in this figure here, that we packed with ulva resulted in statistically significantly lower levels of both nitrate and ammonium. Remember, these are the things we want to have less of because they're leading to things like harmful algal blooms. And the question is, when it comes to kelp, how much nitrogen can it remove? Well, we've done some analyses, and I'm not going to go through all the details, but let me say that it looks like we can get up to 1 pound of nitrogen removed per 100-foot line, which would mean 12 pounds on a dozen lines. Now, Mike talked about a 1-acre oyster farm. That could be almost 200 pounds of nitrogen. And for perspective, there's a lot of effort on Long Island about trying to upgrade our septic systems. You heard me talk about the idea that most of the nitrogen overload is coming from on-site septic systems. And so one of those systems in a given year, if you have a 2-person home, is going to remove about 12 pounds of nitrogen. That's 12 lines of kelp. And if you had the bigger version, a full acre, that could be up to 18 homes. And the question may be, further thinking about the nitrogen being used by the kelp, we did an experiment last summer just to find out where is the nitrogen potentially coming from? What kind of nitrogen might it be mitigating? We used isotopes to determine this. And again, in the interest of time, I can't go through a whole lecture on nitrogen isotopes, but I'll just simply say when we use this, what we call the Del 15 signature of the nitrogen in the kelp, we can trace where that nitrogen is coming from. Really just differentiates between wastewater derived or fertilizer derived. And here's the punchline. If it's wastewater, this is what it looks like. And when it's fertilizer, this is what it's look like. So where's the nitrogen coming from these kelp? The kelp are using? Well, it's consistent with our models. The nitrogen's coming from wastewater, and that's the nitrogen they're using. Now, in the event people are saying, oh, gross, I'm eating wastewater. Remember, this is the molecule nitrogen. So there's no other, anything but a nitrogen atom that weighs 14 or 15 molecular weight attached to it. So this says nothing to any other contaminants, but it does say that we have a wastewater problem here on Long Island, and it says that the kelp, you can see, are able to help address that by removing very large amounts of nitrogen. But what about harmful algal blooms? What can seaweeds possibly do with harmful algal blooms? Well, my lab has actually been investigating this for about a dozen years. So our first paper on this was published in 2011. And you can see our first effort was specifically looking at ulva. And you can see this paper in particular. I believe this, you can get this free online. If not, I can email it to anyone. And we looked at 7 different harmful algal bloom species. I'm just going to focus on one here. That's brown tides, or Oreococcus anaphrogefferens. These have been the most damaging harmful algal blooms on Long Island from an economic point of view. They literally ended the bay scallop fishery, which was the largest bay scallop fishery on the east coast of the US going back in the 80s, and prevented any recovery of the hard clam fishery on the south shore of Long Island, which again was the largest hard clam fishery on the east coast of the United States. What we found is that the brown tide is highly sensitive to ulva. So on the left, you're looking at a laboratory experiment where we're growing the brown tide without ulva, and here it is with. And you can see, I don't even need to tell you, your eyes can show you exactly what the results are. We can essentially eliminate the brown tide in 4 days in the lab. This is what we call a mesocosm experiment. So this was using large volumes of water and essentially the same exact result. Our controls, we had a little bit of growth and they hung in there for days, but within a single day, we lost most of the brown tide in this experiment. So clearly, ulva is able to inhibit brown tide. And again, we concluded in this paper, it's likely via something we call allelopathy. We also looked at another seaweed, Porphyra, which happens to be the most farmed seaweed on the planet. And we found similar results. So here's a laboratory experiment using different levels of Porphyra. And you can see not even very large levels. And we found that, again, the brown tide species is very sensitive. This is ours, by the way, on the x-axis, label dropped off, but very sensitive to this seaweed. At low levels, we see just a few days, the complete loss of these cells, while without it, the culture continues to grow. So on Long Island, as we think about different types of harmful algal blooms, we have to look at the calendar. And so you can see the harmful algal blooms that we experience in marine waters occur on a very well-known timetable due to upper temperature thresholds and ideal temperatures for the different types of harmful algae. And so as it turns out, many of the harmful algal blooms that we have occur during the summer, but outside of the realm of of kelp. And so we really need to target our seaweeds if we're going to think about them being active against harmful algal blooms. We need to match the seasonality of the harmful algal bloom to the different types of seaweeds. And so that's why when we think about what is probably the most dangerous to humans, or not even probably, definitely the most dangerous of the harmful algal blooms to humans, Alexandrium, we can't think about the summer seaweeds. We really need to focus on something like kelp. And just to mention briefly why we worry about Alexandrium. So of course, the brown tide was extremely damaging to the economy here in New York. But Alexandrium makes saxitoxin. Saxitoxin is a neurotoxin that has a potency 1,000 times greater than cyanide. And filter feeding bivalves, when filtering the water, can accumulate that toxin. And the organism is widespread on Long Island. So here's data we've accumulated over the last decade and a half or so. And anywhere in the red is a place where you can get toxicity within shellfish. And in fact, during this time frame, there's been more than a half a dozen locations across Long Island where the shellfish got toxic enough that the shellfish beds had to be closed by the New York State DEC. And to our knowledge, no one's gotten sick from eating those shellfish, partly because the DEC is an excellent monitoring program. But the threat is always there. And sometimes, even a DEC threat is not going to help some marine animals. And so, for example, we had a very unfortunate situation in 2015 where we had literally hundreds of diamondback terrapin turtles that died. Initially, people hypothesized it was due to Alexandrium. Honestly, I chuckled until we actually did the research and we found the extremely high levels of toxicity in the mussels in that region. found the muscle in the DNA of the gastrointestinal tract of the Diamondback terrapin turtles and did the math to determine that in some cases, just a single muscle would be enough to be a lethal dose for these animals that eat shellfish. So to talk about the ability of seaweeds to mitigate Alexandrium, I'm going to highlight some work that's been done by my graduate student, Peter Silvers, and this is being supported specifically by New York Sea Grant. Much of the work has been on sugar kelp, but he's also done some work on Irish moss, which also is a cultivatable seaweed, and he's done some work with ulva. In the interest of time, I'm really going to highlight the work on Alexandrium. And I should mention this research has been recently submitted for publication, and we're hopeful it'll be published this year. So what you're looking at right now is what a healthy Alexandrium cell looks like. And all that brown is its chloroplast. It's a photosynthetic organism. It needs those chloroplasts to function, to grow, to divide and make more cells and unfortunately make toxin. What happens when you expose it to kelp or other seaweeds? Well, that's what the cells begin to look like. And, a picture's worth 1,000 words, but essentially what's happening is that chloroplast is shrinking up within the cell, and the cell is going through what we call apoptosis. It's dying off, and that chloroplast is spilling out. So I could probably stop speaking here. You get the idea, but let's just look at some numbers. Here's similar to some of the plots I showed before. In this case, Peter was looking at 2 different concentrations of sugar kelp, that's the Saccharina latissima, as well as Irish moss, Chondrus crispus. And so what you can see is while the controls, the culture without anything grows great, as long as you start getting into, it looks like we got some ulva in there as well, once you get into even moderate densities of either kelp, ulva, or the higher densities of the Irish moss, the cells begin to don't grow at all, and in fact begin to die off. He's also done experiments using water from the environment, right? Not in the lab, but getting water during a bloom. And so this is an experiment he did last year where he added some nutrients. He did nothing to the water. And you can see that was how many cells there were at the end of that experiment. Added nutrients, had a minor effect, but when he added nutrients, but then also added kelp, you can see the big effect here. And this is, I'm recalling now, this is within his what he called a mesocosm experiment. This is large volume, 300 liters, and a very significant, more than 3-fold reduction. And again, not only is it lower than the control, it's lower than not only is it lower than with the nutrients, but it's also lower than the control, just by adding this moderate amount of sugar kelp. In the same experiment, he also measured nutrients. So, why would this be happening? We then turn to the nutrients. Here are 3 different important nutrients: nitrate, ammonium, and phosphate. In our nutrient addition treatment, you should be able to see the bars are all higher as we would expect because we were adding nutrients. So there's more nitrate in that treatment, more ammonium, more phosphate. When we had the kelp there, despite the fact we were adding the same exact amount of nutrients every day, the nutrient levels were lower. So these 2 treatments had the same nutrient additions, but what you're seeing is that the kelp is mitigating the addition of nutrients and keeping them actually lower than the control. So when we look at the nutrients, partly explains the results, although if our whole paper, when you look at the sum of the research, we also know that a lot of the effects are actually from those allelopathic compounds that we know that the sugar kelp also have. The final experiment I'm going to show from Peter and Alexandrium was looking at the accumulation of saxitoxin into blue mussels, right? And that's what we really care the most about, right? This toxin getting into the mussels is what can make people sick. And if you're a shellfish farmer, it's going to inhibit you from selling your product. So what would happen if you ran an experiment? And this is exactly what he did. One where he had mussels exposed to the toxic cells. And then in parallel, of course, he did 4 of these each or 3 of these each, exposing the mussels not only to the cells, but having kelp there as well. And then specifically looking at what happens to how fast does saxitoxin, this compound of concern, this neurotoxin, accumulate in the shellfish. Here's the answer. You can see that by adding the sugar kelp, Peter was able to significantly reduce the amount of toxicity, the amount of toxin in the shellfish tissue. And these numbers are important. What you're looking at here is the FDA closure limit. So essentially, in his experiment, if he didn't administer the kelp, the shellfish became too toxic to consume. But by having the kelp present, he was able to restrict the accumulation of toxicity and keep it below the closure limit. So a really, in my mind, very important result. I want to now turn to ocean acidification again. I mentioned it before, and it results from the accumulation of CO2 in our atmosphere. It's affecting our oceans, and it affects bivalves. And so, the important thing about bivalves, their shell is made of something known as calcium carbonate, right? So what they do is they take calcium out of the water and carbonate out of the water to make that calcium carbonate shell. Now, I can tell you as a marine scientist that calcium is the fourth most abundant element in seawater. It's one of the reasons seawater is salty. The bivalves will never lack for calcium in any marine and frankly even freshwater environment. Carbonate is the limiting element. Ocean acidification starts to disrupt this process because when you accumulate CO2 in the atmosphere, it enters our oceans and it reacts immediately with water to form this compound bicarbonate that's very stable and a hydrogen ion. And if you may remember your old chemistry classes, acidity is measured by pH. The H in pH is the hydrogen ion. And it's an inverse log scale. And so therefore, the more hydrogen you have, the lower the pH gets and the more acidic the water gets. The problem doesn't end there, however. Remember, I briefly mentioned, I'll say again, this bicarbonate is an incredibly stable molecule. And in fact, that's how most of the inorganic carbon wants to be. So when you have this hydrogen ion, it doesn't stay there for long. What it actually does is it reacts with this carbonate ion and makes another bicarbonate. And that's the problem for the shellfish. They needed that carbonate, but now it's going to bicarbonate because of this acidification. And that's why future models suggest that as the CO2 levels rise in our oceans, the carbonate levels will be declining. And just very briefly, about a decade ago, my laboratory documented the very lethal effects of ocean acidification on bivalves, particularly early life stages. So here's the survival of hard clam and scallop larvae exposed to different levels of CO2. The first level is actually what we call a pre-industrial level, so what we used to have. 390, well, that was what we had during that time. Remember, now we're already up to 417, but a decade ago, we were at 390. And here's where we're looking to be at the end of the century and next century. And the results are clear. Turn up the CO2, the survival of the early life stage bivalves will decline significantly. Not only is their survival goes down, but they become smaller. Here are some scanning electron micrographs we're able to make. This is work I should emphasize done by my doctoral student, Stephanie Talmadge, who's still with us on Long Island in Hampton Bays as a science research teacher. And these images clearly show as you ramp up the CO2 levels, you can see what happens to the size of these shellfish. And excitingly, I should mention that this image was picked up first by the National Climate Assessment and also by the Obama White House. It was used of one of only 4 figures in their publication, The Challenge of Ocean Acidification, published in 2014. Beyond them being smaller, we did, Stephanie was able to slice open those shellfish. So here's a side view of those shells. You can see under normal CO2, the shells are quite thick. And you can see they become quite frail at the highest level of CO2. In fact, many of them weren't even able to be prepped. So that's a problem clearly for shellfish. So where would seaweeds and kelp come into play here? Well, I showed you already that they're photosynthetic organisms. They're going to be sucking up that CO2 and soaking it up as they grow and potentially combating that acidification. And we've done some research already that emphasizes the possibility of this happening. This wasn't done with kelp, rather, but was done with ulva. But still, we published this in 2018. We looked at 4 different, species of bivalves: oysters, hard clams, bay scallops, blue mussels. In all cases, we could combat the acidification with the seaweed. And let me give you an example of how that worked. Here's some results with oysters, which we know are the most aquacultured organisms in New York. And when you co-locate the oysters with the ulva, there's a slight effect on their growth rates. When you hit them with CO2, however, you can see they almost stop growing. These are juvenile oysters, I should emphasize, but still, the growth rates drop tremendously. But when they're co-located with the seaweed, you can recover a good amount of that growth. So again, here evidence that the seaweeds are helping to increase the growth rate of bivalves and the chemistry showed, by taking up the CO2. And turning back to some of Peter's results, here is a summary figure that he had with regards to pH. And so in the red is the control without any seaweeds. And here he's nicely color-coded how the pH of the water changes with the amount of macroalgae or seaweed for ulva, for kelp, and for iris moss. And the upshot is, acidification is when the pH goes down. In this particular case, what we're showing is massive basification. That is, upping the pH and making it more basic, not more acidified, which means that if there was the threat of acidification, again, giving the evidence that these seaweeds would be combating that acidification because of their ability via photosynthesis to drive up the pH. So clearly there are many potential benefits for protecting shellfish aquaculture with kelp, combating harmful algal blooms, both their intensity and toxicity, and also acidification. There's a final topic I want to address. Lindsay had suggested, Dr. Goldberg might talk about seaweeds as fertilizer. And so I did actually just throw in a few slides on that. Now, I mentioned that wastewater is the biggest source of nitrogen on Long Island, but fertilizer is number 2. And is also important, is maybe something we could turn the spigot off on right away. One way to think about it, or I always think about it, and maybe this helps other people visualize it as well, every spring there's probably dozens of 18-wheelers coming over the bridges, bringing thousands of pounds of nitrogen fertilizer onto Long Island. So importing nitrogen, exactly what we want to not do. But what if we could take those seaweeds and turn them back into some kind of fertilizer, in which case we could stem that flow and reduce that total nitrogen load. So is that possible? Well, let me just give you some examples of some of the things we've looked at. So here's a figure where I've purposely hidden the x-axis for now. So I'll describe what it shows, and then I'll unveil it. And we'll make it a little bit of a game here. What you're looking at is the nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations. One of these sets of bars, so again, nitrogen in the blue, phosphorus in the orange. One of these sets of bars is Miracle-Gro, prepared as suggested. So commercial grade Miracle-Gro that you purchase in the store. The others are different attempts at turning seaweeds into fertilizer. And so now let me pull back the curtain and show you what the bars actually are. So there on the left is your Miracle-Gro. Now we've been working on many methods over many years. And so you can see our method 1 was not so successful. But through the years, we've tried different approaches, and some of them have been quite successful, to the point where, again, you can't tell the difference. If you look at the ones on the left, between the kelp, go back here, you can't tell the difference between the kelp and the Miracle-Gro with these 2 advanced methods. And as it turns out, some of the summer seaweeds like ulva and gracilaria are even richer in nutrients. So we'll get to that momentarily. Okay. Well, I can't give a talk without putting my son in the talk. Here's my son holding 2 sets of eggplants. So this is an experiment we did a couple of years ago, and you can guess what the punchline is. One of these sets was grown with our seaweed-based fertilizer, and one was not. And beyond a picture, let's have some data. Here's the weight of eggplants that was grown with our seaweed-based fertilizer. And so you can see it goes along with what was pulled right off of the vine. Somewhat similar results here with peppers, and specifically now on the left looking at weights, and on the right looking at the number of fruits. These are statistically significant increases in yields. And then here with marigolds, we have a lot of data on marigolds, but what I'm showing you here, we have a positive and negative control. Positive is Miracle-Gro. The negative control is without fertilizer. And here we see that perhaps if you look at the result when we mix the kelp with those summer seaweeds, we might be onto something as well. And that the kelp is certainly better than the negative control, statistically so, but it's not as good as the summer seaweeds, or the summer seaweeds are a little bit better, and it's a combination that has the best yield. And so it may be that seaweeds harvested for bioextraction could be recycled as fertilizer and reduce the need to import fertilizer onto Long Island. So with that, I am done. And so wrapping up here, what I've shown you is that seaweeds can improve water quality by removing CO2 and nitrogen, and by excreting oxygen, and maybe allelopathic compounds to inhibit harmful algal blooms. And specifically on the sugar kelp front, I've shown you that it can lyse harmful algal bloom cells. It can reduce the toxicity of harmful algal blooms within mussels, and certainly can mitigate ocean acidification by driving up pH. Now, I will say there's a lot more research that needs to be done. The work we've done, in my mind, has been extremely important, but we need to understand scale. How do you scale all of this to maximize the environmental benefit? And that's what, you've heard some very smart people today. They're thinking about scaling for economy and scaling to maximize kelp yields. My job is to figure out how we scale this to maximize environmental benefits. And Peter in my lab and other people working very hard on that, and we'll hopefully have more details in that in the future. So with that, my presentation is done, and I'm gonna let now, if there are any questions, I'm gonna let Kendall read them to me. She's gonna assist me on that front, do me the favor that I was able to do for her. So Kendall, do we have any questions?
I do see one that came in from Jason. He said, can you comment on any allelopathic effects that kelp might have on the algae that the oysters or mussels eat? Is there a greater effect on the Alexandrium than, say, T. iso? Would keeping the different macroalgae growing on an oyster cage be a net benefit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you for asking, Jason. And so, again, didn't have time to show all the results, but the happy news is that the same experiments where we use the bloom water and we see the Alexandrium go away, we see the total amount of phytoplankton stay equal. And so what that suggests or indicates is that other phytoplankton are coming in. So we're selectively removing the Alexandrium, other phytoplankton are coming in and growing up. And that is actually consistent with a publication that came out of China in the last year or so, where they've been looking on kelp farms in China, showing that the kelp actually increased the diversity of the phytoplankton, which, as you point out, Jason, are the food for the oysters. So we do need to be concerned about that, but the good news is that it looks like it's not at all removing all the food, but rather it seems to be targeting these dinoflagellates that are the harmful algal bloom species.
We've got another question from Aaron, and I saw maybe a patent pending or some sort of indication on your slide about the fertilizer, but it says, could we have an idea of how to recreate the seaweed fertilizers? Yeah,
I know that the IP, intellectual property office at Stony Brook would slap me if I said anything. So it's something we're working on, and again, it's because the research is done through Stony Brook. They're intellectual property, and so they're in the process of getting that out. But it's we've tried a few, I'll just say over the years, we've tried a few different approaches, and we seem to be landing on one that's maximal. We actually have a couple of different ways we could administer it now, both as a dried product and as a liquid product.
The next one is, and if this isn't a question for you, let me know and I can respond to it. But are there any farms that are currently harvesting different types of macroalgae year round, and or with a strategic view towards mitigating blooms and toxins?
So I'll start, and then Kendall, maybe you can share the Connecticut experience. But I'll say that, we have been, as I mentioned, growing Gracilaria and Ulva, and we're going to be doing more of that this coming year. We got a grant from the Long Island Sound Study to collaborate actually with Kendall and to look at the growing out of those species, both to see how they grow in different locations, but also with an eye towards how can we, as I mentioned before, what's the scale needed to maximize environmental benefit. But I don't think, and we've done a little bit of this on some of the oyster farms as well. I know on Great Gun, we've done a little bit of Gracilaria, but there hasn't been a lot. Kendall, how about in Connecticut?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most farmers who are growing commercially in this area are focused on winter crops, so different types of kelp. And the only type of kelp that's grown commercially in Long Island Sound is sugar kelp. In other areas of New England, particularly in Gulf of Maine, there are definitely farmers growing other species, Alaria, for example. And then in other parts of the country, we're working with farmers and some scientific teams who are looking at that multi-season rotation. So looking at those warm water crops like Gracilaria and Ulva, and then a rotation with a cold water or winter crop like a kelp. Sometimes it's site specific, what can grow there, but another one of the reasons why farmers in this area are focused on that winter crop is, well, diversification of an operation. So it has a complementary season, maybe with your oyster farm, but it requires different types of gear that can be deployed in the fall and removed in the spring before, say, recreational boat traffic picks up, or other types of commercial fishing operations and folks are out in the water. So we're looking at things that are kind of complementary to other uses. I guess one more piece is that when Dr. Yarish was studying kelp cultivation back in the early, I want to say 2010, 2011, he was looking at Bronx River estuary at Gracilaria and kelp as well.
And I feel compelled to just mention, because I didn't during my talk, that on the Gracilaria front, so everybody's aware, there are two different species that grow in both Connecticut and New York waters. One is native, one is invasive. The native one is edible, whereas the invasive one is, well, some people call it toxic. So, and so we're developing techniques molecular techniques to identify the difference, because unfortunately they look quite similar. But we're both working at the techniques for the molecular identification, and then the techniques for actually cultivating the ones that we know is the right species, and therefore growing out the native, non-indigenous, non-toxic species.
I don't see any other questions in the chat, but there are a lot of great announcements, including an upcoming panel, Seafood for the Future, which has some recognizable names, including Sean Barrett, who we've mentioned a couple times on this call, Karen Rivara, who many of you probably know through your shellfish work on Long Island, and other folks from East Coast Shellfish Growers Association. And so I encourage you to take a look at those comments, and if anybody else has any questions. It looks like one just came in. May I ask one more question, Chris?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Do you think conservation areas could be a good idea, not for commercial purposes, but solely for carbon sequestration?
Yeah, I mean, clearly this world needs all hands on deck when it comes to addressing the carbon and climate crisis ahead of us and in front of us. And so, I think beyond, and yes, so we need to be sequestering as much carbon as possible. Concurrently, if you're doing that, you'd also be sequestering nitrogen, which we also know is needed. So, I do, obviously the food aspect is very exciting, but you could be sequestering carbon, sequestering nitrogen, and then, in an ideal world, converting that product into something else. And I emphasize fertilizer, but Mike, you're still there. I know you could mention all the other great work that's getting done. I see Casey Emmett from Crop Project here as well. And in fact, Casey, I don't know if you want to say anything about different things that you're doing with Kelp.
Yeah, we're working on a bunch of different stuff. And thanks, by the way. I've learned a ton in the last couple hours. We're working on a bunch of different stuff. So I think, as you guys mentioned, the food kelp as a wholesale ingredient, I think is primary, not only because that's pretty good volume and margins, but also that happens to be an existing market where brands, consumer packaged goods brands might find this a useful ingredient for a few different reasons. But our whole thing is, as Mike talked about, scaling up, working with Greenwave and others to solve the really basic problem of, the logistics of harvesting, but also just the basic drying and stabilization of the ingredient. So that's where we're starting this summer and this spring and summer. And hopefully we have a ton of capabilities beyond that in future years, but that's what we're working on this year.
Okay, thank you.
I see one more question, and this might be one that I could answer, Chris, too.
Sure.
Someone else had asked a question about whether there is a legislative task force or action group or something to the effect of collective work on regulations. I think, as many of you may know, and especially if you're shellfish farmers, there are various industry groups like the Shellfish Growers Associations. But recently, within the past couple of years, the Seaweed Hub, which is a Sea Grant-led program, has developed. Seaweed Hub, and you can find them online. I was going to plug it into the chat here. I'll do that in a minute. But they have various working groups. And so industry partners, farmers, processors, seed suppliers, and so forth that are coming together to work on different issues. One of them is regulations. They also are working to address issues around production and so forth. But it's a national sort of consortium with farmers and operators working across the country. So thank you, Emma, for providing that link.
Okay, and I just want to remind everybody that the fill out the form. We have recorded this and we will circulate it to people, but we need to know how to reach you. So please go ahead and fill out that form, the Google form there. And if you're able to, we'll make sure that you can get a copy of this presentation. So I think with that, we've reached the end. Wow, that went fast. Clearly a lot of exciting progress on the kelp front. And clearly just the tip of the iceberg. I think there are great opportunities that lie ahead on the economic front, on the obviously the farming front, on the environmental front. And in good news, it feels like everybody's pulling in the same direction. So with that, I think there are good things ahead. So I thank everyone kindly for their attention. And don't hesitate to reach out to Kendall or Mike or Lindsay or myself if you have any questions. And again, fill out that form and we'll make sure you can get a copy of this presentation. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And I wish you all a good afternoon and a good evening.
Thank you.
Take care.